What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there today. We're talking about running backs here for Week 7 fantasy football, and boy, is it getting a little bit thin out there at the running back position between bye weeks and even more injuries. There's a lot of people just scrounging, looking for running backs to start on a weekly basis. Kind of want to do a little bit of a temperature check. We told a lot of people here in the offseason to make sure you go running back heavy this year. You're going to need the depth. This is why it's getting scary. So we want to see down below in the comment section how many of you out there still have 2 or 3 solid, must starts every single week on your roster. Throw them down below in the comment section. We're kind of curious to see where you guys are sitting right now at the running back position. But before we get into all the matchups here for Week 7, just a quick reminder, we got a few teams on bye this week, right? The Minnesota Vikings, Miami Dolphins, Indianapolis Colts, Baltimore Ravens, all on a bye. We also have injuries that we're paying attention to. For Joe Mixon, does he play this week or not? That's something we really need to pay attention to. Also going to be without Miles Sanders and Raheem Mostert. Yeah, like I said, it's getting scary. So before we dive into those Week 7 matchups, let's take a look back at Week 6 and see how we did at the running back position. And honestly, I'm pretty happy with the way that running backs turned out in Week 6. We had a total of 58 running backs that we gave a start or sit designation to that actually completed their games this past weekend. 45 of them were correct for an accuracy percentage of 78%. Some of our biggest misses. What about the Detroit backfield? We talked about that backfield causing baldness just because we never know who to trust. How about both DeAndre Swift and Adrian Peterson putting up big games? J.D. McKissick, apparently he's a thing now in Washington. A few of our hits, I had to put Kenyon Drake on the top of it. Sure, even though he kind of capped it off with a 69-yard touchdown run there at the end, he was still inside the top 10 before that. Myles Gaskin, we just talked about not being able to use him this week. He had a great week last week. Ronald Jones continues to show some dominance on the ground, and I had to throw him in there because he's somebody who we've kind of come around on, right? I've always said say no to Rojo. It's kind of been the perfect storm for him this year. All things are lining up, and he continues to produce. So Ronald Jones was a hit for us last week also, but now it's time to head into Week 7. There's some great matchups this week, some potential high scores. Who are they going to be? Let's kick it off right now with Thursday Night Football. And that's where we find the New York Giants and Philadelphia Eagles. And what makes a matchup of 2 one-win teams even worse? How about having one of the only fantasy-relevant options in the game be hurt and not playing? That's right, Miles Sanders will not play this Thursday night, and that one hurts, right? He was just starting to heat up. Some great performances against Baltimore and Pittsburgh, but we're going to be without his 15 fantasy points per game. So now we have to look forward, and what can we expect from Boston Scott now in this backfield? He's not Miles Sanders. He's really not. He needs involvement in the passing game to give him that higher ceiling. He's just not one of those prolific run between the tackles type of bruising running backs. He's reliant on the passing game, and luckily he's got a great matchup for that, right? He's going up against the New York Giants, who allow 10 fantasy points per game just through the air to opposing running backs. So not all bad going forward here for the Philadelphia Eagles, but the fact remains, right? They are short on weapons in Philadelphia. Boston Scott is going to be, a part of this game plan here this week. They don't have a choice. They don't have a lot of other options. I don't dislike Boston Scott one bit this week. Do I want to go out there and say he's going to be a surefire RB1? No, I'm not. He's more of an RB2 flex type of play this week. Hopefully you got him off of waivers this week, because if you're hurting for injuries or bye weeks, he's not a bad fill-in here this week. What about on the New York side of things? We got DEVONTA FREEMAN, right? Back-to-back games with at least 19 touches. We love the volume, right? Right now, we'll take anybody who's getting volume. The problem is he hasn't been overly efficient with that volume, only averaging right around 3.2 yards per carry, and he is not really active at all in the passing game. Philadelphia right now allows right around 17 fantasy points per game, but I really don't love this matchup for DEVONTA FREEMAN. I'm not going to touch anybody in this backfield if I don't have to. I prefer to sit them all. However, due to volume and lack of options, I'll start DEVONTA FREEMAN if I absolutely have to, and just hope that he can find the end zone here this week. All right, so let's move on to Sunday now. In the first matchup, Pittsburgh Steelers, Tennessee Titans, and this game should be way better than the one that we get on Thursday Night Football. This is a matchup of Derrick Henry and James Conner. You never sit Derrick Henry, right? The guy is averaging 21 fantasy points per game, has yet to have a game with less than 20 touches, and you saw what he did last week, right? Well, did you also notice that he had 5 targets in the passing game? If we can start getting Derrick Henry involved in the passing game, watch out. He will carry your fantasy team the rest of the year. Now, it is a difficult matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They only allow right around 13 fantasy points per game, but you never sit King Henry. Ever. You put him in your lineup. For Pittsburgh, can kind of say the same thing for James Conner right now, right? 4 straight games with a touchdown. In 3 of his last 4 games, he's had 100 yards rushing. He looks healthy. He's involved in this offense. What we really need, though, is a closer game, right? So we don't have to worry about not running the ball or putting in Anthony McFarland or Benny Snell. We want the game to stay close, and this is a matchup of 2 5-0 teams. I expect this game to be pretty fun to watch and be a lot closer than what we saw last week for Pittsburgh going up against Cleveland. Tennessee does allow right around 20 fantasy points per game, so I have no issues once again throwing James Conner firmly into the start column. On to the Dallas Cowboys and Washington football team now, a matchup of the NFC East leading Dallas Cowboys going up against the last place team in the division, the Washington football team. What's that? Dallas only has 2 wins. There's only 1 game separating them. Okay, so this game could be a lot closer than it sounds on paper, right? I mean, things in Dallas are just horrible right now. They looked horrible on Monday Night Football against the Arizona Cardinals, but this whole division is an absolute nightmare. Right now, the Cowboys in first place with a 2-4 record, and apparently now Zeke has a case of fumbleitis because he could not hold on to the ball on Monday Night Football. In Week 6, he tied for his highest reception total of the season. That's great. What's bad? He had the lowest rushing total of the entire season as far as rush attempts go. That's bad. That's because they were trailing big early on in that game and could not protect the football. Zeke finished as running back 28 on the week and now gets a matchup going up against Washington, who allows right around 17 fantasy points per game, but it doesn't matter. If you got Zeke, you have to start Zeke. But what about on the football team side of things? What about Antonio Gibson? This is the breakout that so many people want, and it's just being denied. And it's being denied by J.D. McKissic. That's right, J.D. McKissic is he just won't go away, right? He won't go away long enough to give Antonio Gibson that higher ceiling, that higher upside in the passing game. McKissic, 19 receptions over his last 3 games. And if you're in a deeper league, maybe anything 14, 16 teams or larger, I don't mind starting J.D. McKissic as a flex play. Everywhere else, no thanks, I'll pass. And I'll still roll with Antonio Gibson. Right now, the Dallas Cowboys allow just about the same amount, 17 fantasy points per game. But we saw what Kenyon Drake did against this team last week. If we can get one of those big runs to Antonio Gibson, we will be pleasantly surprised here in Week 7. Now, Dallas has allowed 7 rushing touchdowns through the first 6 games of the season. Gibson, more of a low-end running back too, but the ceiling could be higher if he could find the end zone a time or two. Bills and Jets now, and is everybody ready just to push Zach Moss aside and just can that argument? I mean, this guy had so many truthers in the offseason that I haven't heard from in about 6 weeks now. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not up here saying that Devin Singletary has been killing it, because he hasn't, right? But he's still leading this backfield, and it's kind of a Jekyll-Hyde offense, right? Sometimes they look great, sometimes they look completely lost. But this is a matchup going up against the New York Jets, who allow over 23 fantasy points per game just to opposing running backs. That's 7th most in the NFL. I understand Singletary has been disappointing at times, but he's still getting the most touches in this backfield, and this matchup is one that you just can't ignore. I'm still going to start, hopefully as a flex option, Devin Singletary, but with all the injuries and bye weeks, I have a feeling he's some people's RB2. Keep your fingers crossed and hope he can find the end zone here this week. What about the Jets? What about Frank Gore and LaMichael Pirine? I mean, they're still the Jets, right? And this offense is absolutely horrible. Now, we've seen Buffalo struggle against the run, but like I said, it's the Jets. I just don't trust it at this point. It would not surprise me if they start giving LaMichael Pirine more touches to kind of see what they have with that kid. But then again, I wouldn't put it past Adam Gase just to continually feed Frank Gore also. It's a mess in the backfield. It's a bad offense. Not the worst of matchups, but there are better options this week. And personally, I'm going to avoid the backfield altogether of the New York Jets. Panthers and Saints, and it looks like no Christian McCaffrey again this week, but some good news. We get back Alvin Kamara off of his bye week, so throw him directly back into your lineup in a good matchup going up against Carolina, who allows over 24 fantasy points per game. That's 6th most in the NFL. We know Kamara is a must start, but what about Latavius Murray? He's somebody who's seen at least 10 touches a game over their last 3 games and did have a game with multiple touchdowns. Is he an automatic must start? No. But if you're looking for a bye-week fill-in, or maybe your team is just riddled with injuries, there's a lot worse you could do than Latavius Murray. I don't mind starting him here this week also. What about for Carolina? I know a lot of Mike Davis owners last week were sweating until he got that touchdown late in the game. He finished outside of the top 10 for the first time since week 2, had a season low in targets with 3, and only had 55 total yards. The touchdown totally saved a very, very poor day for one Mike Davis. Now, going up against New Orleans, they allowed just under 18 fantasy points per game. However, with no Christian McCaffrey, you can't afford to sit Mike Davis. He's still going to be right here in the start column. Packers and Texans, and what the happened to the Green Bay Packers in Week 6? I mean, they just got spanked by Tampa Bay last week, and now Aaron Jones is coming off his worst game of the season. They were trailing big, though, right? They really couldn't commit to the run this past week. He only had 10 carries for 15 yards, but he does what Aaron Jones does and just continues to find the end zone. He now has 7 touchdowns through 5 games, and those touchdowns continue to save some pretty poor rushing performances on a weekly basis. But I love this matchup here this week. Going up against Houston, it's a chance for them to really bounce back and get some huge numbers. Why? Well, the Texans allow over 28.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's the most in the NFL. I'm looking for Green Bay to get back on track and for some big numbers for Aaron Jones. What about David Johnson and the Houston Texans? He's going to be my Manscaped start of the week here this week. Don't forget, Manscaped, our sponsors here on the season. After this video is over, head over to manscaped.com. Use the promo code HEADLINERS in all caps. Receive 20% off your purchase plus free shipping. Don't miss out on all the great products they have there right now. But as for this week, this is a great matchup, a great opportunity for David Johnson. Green Bay allows just about 28 fantasy points per game itself to opposing running backs, which is second most in the NFL. David Johnson has at least 18 touches over his last 3 games. He's seen about 78% of the snaps, and David Johnson is really where we thought he would be all along, right? A low-end running back to a solid flex with upside. Well, in this matchup, I'm looking for the upside. Don't be surprised if David Johnson finishes inside the top 12 running backs here in Week 7. Browns and Bengals up next, and finally an easier game for Kareem Hunt and the Cleveland Browns, right? I mean, it couldn't get any worse than what it was Week 6 going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, despite that horrible matchup last week, Kareem Hunt's still sitting at running back 8 overall, averaging right around 15 fantasy points per game, and has 6 touchdowns in his last 5 games played. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows right around 20 fantasy points per game. We could see a little bit higher ceiling this week for Kareem Hunt. But let's be honest, this offense was better with Nick Chubb in the backfield also. When they could double down on this running game, it really took all the pressure off of Baker Mayfield. Not being able to do that, we're starting to see Baker make a few more mistakes than maybe we would like to see. However, in the meantime, we're still firing up Kareem Hunt this week because he's seen the bulk of the touches in this backfield. What about on the Bengals side of things for Joe Mixon? Tweaked his ankle last week, and this is something we really need to pay attention to here over the coming days. We'll be having Dr. Ethan Turner on here later in the week trying to see what information we can find, because Joe Mixon has had at least 11 fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. He's had 20 plus total touches 3 straight weeks, and Cleveland allows right around 18 fantasy points per game. This is just one of those things where we have to be somewhat cautious and look at the practice reports as the week progresses. Now, if Joe Mixon sits, do I want to start Gio Bernard? I don't want to. No. No is the answer that I don't want to. You will have to be pretty desperate to start him, really hurt with bye weeks or injuries in order to do that. If you have to, make sure you do it without Joe Mixon. If Joe Mixon is playing in this game, I'm not even thinking about Gio Bernard. So we really just need to pay attention to see how this week progresses before we can really make our decision on this backfield as of right now. Lions and Falcons, and please tell me it's time for DeAndre Swift. I mean, it's DeAndre Swift time, right? Right? I just wish we didn't have to rely on Matt Patricia and the Detroit Lions to make the right decision, because they haven't really done that in the past. But last week, DeAndre Swift showed what he was capable of. Finished as running back 3 overall in fantasy football, had a season high in attempts and yards, and now has a matchup going up against the Atlanta Falcons, who give up right around 18 fantasy points per game. The puzzling part, Swift was still out-touched on the ground by Adrian Peterson. At what point do we not start giving the lion's share, no pun intended, of the work to DeAndre Swift to see what this kid could really do with some real volume? Could it happen this week? I would like to think that they build off the momentum of last week and really start to work this kid in more and more. Please don't screw this up, Matt Patricia. I will start DeAndre Swift over anybody else in this backfield this week. For Atlanta, yeah, Gurley is basically freed, I guess you could say, with no Dan Quinn. He saw a season high in touches last week with 23, and anytime you have a running back that's getting 23 touches in a game, you throw him into your lineup. Now, were those touches efficient? No, they really weren't, but we just chased the volume at this point, right, just because of limited options. The Lions do allow over 25 fantasy points per game, so this is a great matchup for Todd Gurley with Julio Jones back and healthy. That's going to draw defenders outside of the box. Do we see more Todd Gurley once again this week? I think we do. I got him firmly in the start column. Seahawks and Cardinals now, and everybody waved to Kenyon Drake because he made a huge appearance in Week 6 with 20 carries, 164 yards, and 2 touchdowns against the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football, and we're hoping that this is the confidence boost that he needed to really build off this momentum going forward, because this is what Kenyon Drake is capable of. Is he going to go out there every week and do those type of numbers? No, he's not. But he's a lot better than what we've seen the first few weeks of the season. This past week saw 68% of the snaps and out-touched Chase Edmonds 20-6. Now, a lot of people want to say, yeah, what was the big run at the end that really boosted up his numbers? Cool. Yeah, I get that. And they did, but he was still running back 6 before that big run and still had a super solid week. Now, it's a little bit more of a difficult matchup this week going up against Seattle. I'll give him that. They only allow right around 16 fantasy points per game. Now, even though Drake has been a disappointment for the most part of the season, he hasn't been horrible, right? He's still averaged over 10 points per game in all 6 of the games they've played. And then we saw the ceiling game here this past week. Can you really afford to sit a guy who's averaging 18.5 touches a game like Kenyon Drake is? The answer right now is really no. You can't. We're just missing too many other options to take that gamble to put that many touches on your bench. As of right now, Chase Edmonds, more of a deeper league flex play because they are overly committed to Kenyon Drake right now. I know there's a lot of Edmonds truthers out there, but right now, this is still Drake's backfield, and if he can build off this momentum, some big weeks could be coming. Now, what about Seattle? Yeah, we're going to start Chris Carson regardless, right? There's no way you can sit him either. Right now, the Cardinals are giving up on average 119 rushing yards a game and 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Carson has had at least 17 fantasy points in 4 out of his 5 games played so far this season. Plus, the involvement in the passing work is what makes him a safe play on a weekly basis. This is a very underrated defense for Arizona, but I still like Chris Carson, and he's still going to be in the start column here in Week 7. Jags and Chargers, and welcome back Justin Jackson, Joshua Kelly off of your bye week, even though this backfield seems to be Justin Jackson's for the most part, right? I mean, he had 20 touches in Week 5 and saw 59% of the snaps. Now they get a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows almost 25 fantasy points per game, 5th most in the NFL, to opposing running backs. In my opinion, Justin Jackson is still a flex start for me here this week. Joshua Kelly, until we can really see him take over, the bulk of the snaps or the bulk of the touches in this backfield, he remains a little bit more of a risky start, right? There's no reason for them to go away from Jackson because he produced when he was given the opportunity before the bye week. I expect them to be committed to Jackson coming out of the gate here this week, which is the reason why I have him as a start, as a solid flex play here this week. If you're in deeper leagues, then yes, all of a sudden Joshua Kelly in a positive matchup like this becomes an option. For Jacksonville, we can't sit James Robinson though either, right? He's currently running back 6 overall, averaging right around 15 fantasy points per game. He has 4 top 20 finishes out of his last 5 games, but the Chargers only allow right around 15 fantasy points per game. We can't sit him, right? What we really need from James Robinson is to continue to be involved in the passing game. That's something that a lot of people weren't counting on early on, but because of it is really boosting his floor on a weekly basis, and that's why James Robinson, basically a must-start every week now. Niners and Patriots, and how much does it hurt to lose Raheem? I'm now a must-start Mostert to your fantasy football rosters, right? I mean, seeing him go down after getting huge volume in the first half of last week's game was a total kick in the... You know what I mean. It was bad, but now we're back to Jerick McKinnon, Jeff Wilson Jr., and JaMycal Hasty, none of which are comparable to Raheem Mostert at all. But regardless, they're going up against the New England run defense, who allows right around 14.5 fantasy points per game, which is 5th best in the NFL. I wouldn't be surprised if this week we saw all three of these guys. We'll probably see a lot more Jerick McKinnon in the passing game. We'll see some Jeff Wilson between the tackles. We may see some JaMycal Hasty getting everything else, right? A little of each and kind of spelling those two guys. Is it something where I really want to rush out and start any of these guys? Not really. If you're in a PPR league, I will start Jerick McKinnon in hopes that they can get him involved in the passing game. But now that they have Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, utilizing Kendrick Bourne a little bit more, really the need for the passing game from the running backs just isn't there like it was earlier in the season. Jerick McKinnon is a risky start, but the only one that I would risk it on here this week. For New England, it's going to continue, right? I've said it for weeks. If Cam Newton is under center, he's going to kill the numbers of the starting running back for the New England Patriots, whoever you want to make that be. In a close game last week versus Denver, the starting running back Damian Harris only had 6 carries. Cam himself had 10. The week prior to that, Harris saw 17 carries without Cam Newton under center. As far as I'm concerned, as long as Cam Newton is the quarterback of the New England Patriots, the only running back that I have any interest in is James White, and that's in PPR leagues. He's getting over 10 touches a week, and he's one of those guys who's flex-worthy every single week in PPR leagues. Now, they are going up against San Francisco, and San Francisco only allows 12.8 fantasy points per game, which is 2nd best in the NFL. James White is the only guy that I'm willing to risk it on here in this backfield this week. Chiefs and Broncos, and this one could be pretty interesting, right? What happens here, right? A lot of question marks in this matchup. Is Le'Veon Bell active? I mean, with Clyde Edwards-Helaire coming off his biggest game of the season for 26 carries and 161 yards rushing, what do we see from Bell? I mean, CEH was just running back 5 on the week. Do they use Bell? I have to think that they use him somewhat in this offense, but Denver is a very, very tough matchup. In fact, they're number 1 against opposing running backs, allowing only 12 fantasy points per game. Are we going to sit either one of these guys in Kansas City? I'm not going to sit CEH, to be completely honest, until we see them utilize Bell to the point where CEH isn't startable. I'm going to continue to start him. If you're in a deeper league and you want to gamble on Le'Veon Bell, I would prefer to do that in a 14-team league or larger. Let's see what type of role we have before we make those assumptions. As of right now, this is still the backfield of CEH, and that's the guy who I will continue to start until proven otherwise. What about for Denver? Is Melvin Gordon going to be back? I mean, his hearing for his court case isn't until November 13th. Maybe he plays, up until that time. The Broncos have already come out and said that they're not going to discipline him. The reason he didn't play last week is because he came down with strep throat, apparently. However, what about this week? He could very easily be active going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, who allow just over 18 fantasy points per game. But Phillip Lindsay did okay last week, right? 23 carries, 101 yards against the New England run defense that we just talked about in the last matchup. Both of these guys, in my opinion, as of right now, are flex starts. If anything else comes out about this backfield or Melvin Gordon not being with the team or whatever it may be, that will only bump up Phillip Lindsay. But until we see them not split in this backfield, they kind of, lower that ceiling on a weekly basis because it's going to come down to who gets the touchdown, and I don't see multiple touchdowns in this backfield this week. That's why hopefully you can rely on them nothing more than a flex play here in Week 7. Bucks and Raiders, and Ronald Jones continues to run away with this backfield as Leonard Fournette continues to deal with injuries. How good has Ronald Jones been lately? 3 straight games with over 100 yards rushing. 3 straight weeks finishing inside the top 20. 3 straight games with at least 20 touches in that game. Plus, now he gets a matchup with the Raiders, who allow over 26 fantasy points per game, which is 3rd most in the NFL. I do not care if Leonard Fournette plays or not. I will start Ronald Jones once again here this week. Now, if for some reason he is 100% healthy going into the weekend and you play in a deeper league, maybe you're looking for a bye week fill-in or an injury replacement, Then I will look at Leonard Fournette, but only if he is 100% good to go going into the weekend. What about on the Raiders side of things and Josh Jacobs? Good to have him back off of his bye week, but Tampa Bay is no pushover, right? They're allowing only 15.6 fantasy points per game, and Jacobs hasn't had less than 18 touches in a game so far this season, which is the volume we love to see. But what we really need to continue to see more of is work in the passing game, right? He's averaging 4 targets a game, which is okay. If we can get that closer to 6, we're going to be a lot happier. This is not one of those smash starts for Josh Jacobs. Not the greatest of matchups. Coming off the bye week is a plus, but there's no way we can afford to sit those 18 touches a game. He's sticking right here in the start column. Monday Night Football, we got the Bears and the Rams, and David Montgomery coming off his best fantasy week since week 2. Last week saw a season high in carries also with 19, so a running back with a pulse, more than likely we're going to start him, right? Yeah, we will. I just wish the touchdowns were there because that's really what's going to raise up his ceiling. Without those touchdowns, he's very volume dependent. He needs to go out there on a weekly basis and get 17 to 25 touches just to give you a decent floor because the rushing totals aren't super high. Now he's got a matchup going up against the Rams. They allow right around 17 fantasy points per game. Not one of these absolute, I'm looking for a huge game type starts. But with the volume that he's currently getting, I don't think you can afford to sit him during your fantasy football week here in week 7. We'll go ahead and start David Montgomery and just cross our fingers. For the Rams, we'll talk about this backfield for a minute because we talked about it last week about a backfield that causes baldness, right? Because you just don't really understand it. As of right now, the best performer on the season is Darrell Henderson. He's kind of seemed to take over the bulk of that work in the backfield. He looks the best when he touches the ball. Cam Akers is the future, right? But did they forget about him last week? I mean, he wasn't used at all last week for the most part, and it's kind of leaving a lot of people to scratch their heads because Cam Akers is the future of this backfield, but Darrell Henderson isn't going away. However, they're not committing to Darrell Henderson and giving him the backfield, so it's just a huge mess. As of right now, the only running back which I would want to roster and actually think about starting on a weekly basis is Darrell Henderson as of right now. He seems to be the leader in volume and production, right? Because that's kind of what we're looking for. The other guys, the usage just isn't there. The production isn't there. I don't blame the players. I blame the coaching staff because I just don't understand what they're trying to accomplish here by continually splitting these guys up. By committing to one of them and maybe making one of them the change of pace back, they may be able to get into a little bit of a rhythm and really start producing. But until that happens, it's going to be a huge head scratcher, a huge, what if every single week. As of right now, I'll start Darrell Henderson, but that's it for the Rams. All right, those are my starts and sits for the running back position here, Week 7 fantasy football. We can't get cute, right? There's some bad matchups for some guys that we just don't like, but we can't afford to sit them just due to the volume that they're getting because we're running out of a lack of options here in 2020. It's absolutely sucked. It's been way difficult to try to figure out, but hopefully you have enough options available to you in your league to piece together a roster until this starts to clear up here a little bit later on in the season. We greatly appreciate that support. If you're looking for guaranteed answers to your fantasy football questions, those can be found on our Patreon. The link is down below in the description. We greatly appreciate the support. We look forward to talking to you all week long. Have a good one. Thanks.